Okay, imagine this. You finally found it. The perfect apartment, great location, rent seems fair, you're ready to go. You get the lease, pen in hand, and then, D. Uh-oh. You spot a clause that just feels off.
Yeah, that moment, right. Just when you think you're home free, something in the fine print gives you pause.
Mm,
What does this weird wording actually mean for you?
exactly. And this isn't just hypothetical. We're looking at a case today involving Zhao Lin, a recent grad apartment hunting. Found a place, landlord Mr. Chen, looked standard, mostly.
But then there was this one paragraph. Our source material, drawing from Raymond Yang's insights on leases and asset management, highlights this. Mr. Chen's contract had what's called a life cherishing clause.
Uh,
Shum.
yeah.
Life cherishing clause. Wow, that's quite a name. And the clause itself is pretty heavy, too. It basically said if the tenant, Xiaolin, died, unnaturally in the apartment,
Right, making it what's known as a stigmatized property, a shim, which hurts its value.
then Xiaolin's family, his heirs, even his guarantors, would have to pay massive compensation. And massive is right. The clause demanded either 75% of the property's market price,
75%.
or, get this, his heirs and guarantors would have to actually buy the apartment at full market price.
Buy it back. After something tragic happened there, that feels incredibly harsh. Shaolin was, understandably, pretty worried.
He asked the landlord, Mr. Chen, about it.
And Mr. Chen's reason?
Well, according to the source, Mr. Chen framed it as protection for himself. Said housing prices are high, and if the property value tanks because it becomes, stigmatized, that's a huge loss for him.
Okay, I get the financial concern, but...
He also apparently mentioned something about it encouraging the tenant to cherish life.
Okay. But the real question for Shaolin, and for anyone listening who might see this, is this even legal? Can they really enforce this? What are the actual risks if you sign?
Because these clauses, while they do pop up, and they raise some really fundamental questions about what's fair in a rental agreement.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're using the legal analysis and case examples from our source to unpack this whole thing. We're looking specifically at how these life-cherishing clauses affect you as a tenant in Taiwan.
Are they valid? Can you challenge them? And, really importantly, what protections does the law actually give you? We want to focus on your options here.
Let's start peeling this back. What exactly are these clauses? You mentioned the name, but what are we really talking about?
Yeah, they're sometimes called anti-suicide clauses, or more broadly, stigmatized property clauses. Landlords put them in leases, hoping to cover themselves financially if an unnatural death occurs and makes the property harder to sell or rent.
Trying to manage that specific risk up front, what kind of things do they usually say?
Well, like in Jaolin's case, they often demand compensation, sometimes a big chunk of the market value, like that 75% three-quarters figure.
Or the buyback obligation.
Or the buyback, yeah.
Yeah.
Which, as you said, forcing grieving relatives to buy the property. That's extreme.
Are there even more extreme versions?
Oh, definitely. The source mentions seeing things online, like on Dcard, labeled daredevil leases. Some apparently included actual violent threats, which are obviously illegal and way over the line.
Okay, that's terrifying.
Right. But even the more formally worded ones, the ones trying to sound legal, still carry that same basic demand for potentially huge compensation.
So why are landlords doing this? What's the main driver?
It really boils down to managing financial risk. They're worried about the property value dropping significantly if it gets labeled a stigmatized property. It's about perception, market value.
And they want to shift that risk.
Exactly. Shift the potential cost onto the tenant or their estate. It's also an attempt to get a clearer path to damages than maybe suing under general law.
Like having it written down in the contract makes it easier to claim.
That's the idea. They think it bypasses the need to prove certain things you'd have to prove in a normal lawsuit, which we'll get into. Maybe some landlords think it deters tenants, but realistically, for someone in deep distress, a lease clause probably isn't on their mind.
Yeah, that seems unlikely. It also sort of highlights the power imbalance, doesn't it? Landlords often hold more cards.
It can, yeah. Especially in a tight rental market.
Okay, so we understand what they are and why landlords might want them. Now, the million-dollar question for tenants, can they actually enforce these? Are they legally binding?
This is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, much better for tenants recently. There's been a key legal change you need to know about.
Ooh. Tell me more. What changed?
Okay, here's the big one. An amendment to the Residential Tenactment Act back in February 2023. It basically established that unless it's like a super short-term stay or government housing, The relationship between a landlord and a residential tenant is now legally considered a consumer relationship.
Wait, so renting an apartment is like buying a product, even if my landlord is just some guy, not a big company.
That's right. For most residential leases now, the Consumer Protection Act fully applies, even to individual landlords.
Wow. That feels like a really big deal for tenant rights.
It is. It's a game changer. Because it means if your landlord uses a standard contract, and most do, even if they just downloaded a template clauses like these life-cherishing ones, get put under a much stricter microscope.
Under the Consumer Protection Act, what does that look like?
Well, the key thing is the fairness test. Under Article 12 of the Consumer Protection Act, standard clauses that go against good faith and are clearly unfair to you, the consumer, the tenant, they're invalid, void.
Clearly unfair. So something like demanding 75% of the property value or forcing heirs to buy it, that sounds pretty unfair.
Exactly. That kind of excessive liability, especially hitting grieving family members, has a very strong argument for being clearly unfair and violating principles like equal reciprocity. It puts a disproportionate burden on the tenant's side.
So a court could just strike it down based on that unfairness?
Very likely, yes. The Consumer Protection Act specifically prohibits standard terms that unfairly limit consumer rights or pile on excessive obligations. These clauses often fit that description perfectly.
Okay, the Consumer Protection Act is a powerful tool then, especially after 2023. What about before that, or just under the general civil code? Are there other arguments?
Yes, absolutely. Even outside the Consumer Protection Act, the Civil Code itself has principles about fairness in contracts. Article 2471, for instance, also says standard clauses that are clearly unfair given the circumstances are invalid.
Similar idea, just in the general code.
Right. And think about those huge compensation amounts, like the 75%. The Civil Code, Article 252, gives courts the power to reduce excessive penalty clauses or liquidated damages down to a reasonable level.
So even if the clause itself isn't thrown out completely?
The court could still look at that 75% demand and say, whoa, that's way too high, unreasonable, and then cut it down significantly based on what they think is fair compensation for any actual provable loss the landlord suffered.
Is there anything else in the civil code, like broader principles?
Yeah, Article 72 says legal acts that violate public order or good morals are invalid. There's definitely an argument to be made about whether forcing families into huge debt or property purchases after a tragedy aligns with, good morals or public order.
Seems questionable.
And Article 148 talks about exercising rights in good faith. An extremely one-sided punitive clause might violate that principle too.
Okay, so multiple angles to challenge the clause itself. But what if the landlord tries a different route? Like maybe the clause is shaky, so they just try to sue the estate under general tort law for the drop in property value. You mentioned that's harder for them.
Much harder, generally speaking, yes. Landlords might try to use Article 184 of the Civil Code, the main tort provision, to claim damages. But for this specific situation, value loss because a property became stigmatized, it's a real uphill battle for them.
Why is it so tough? Let's break that down.
Two main reasons, really. First is the type of loss involved.
The type of loss.
Yeah. Most courts see the drop in market value just because the property is now considered a shoe as pure economic loss. The building isn't physically damaged, right? It can still be lived in. The loss is purely financial, tied to market psychology and stigma.
Okay. And why does pure economic loss matter legally?
Because the main part of tort law, Article 184, paragraph 1, front part, generally covers infringement of rights like physical injury or property damage. Pure economic loss, especially when it's not tied to physical damage, often doesn't fit neatly under that. Many courts say it's not the kind of right infringement that part of the law is designed to cover.
So the landlord can't just easily say, my property right was damaged because the value went down.
Not easily, no. If the damage is just market perception, not physical harm, it's a weak argument under that part of the law. The other huge hurdle for the landlord is proving the tenant's intent or negligence.
Proving the tenant meant to lower the property value or was careless about it.
Exactly. And think about the context, usually a suicide. Proving someone in that state intended to cause financial harm to the landlord or was even legally negligent regarding property value is incredibly difficult, maybe impossible. Courts are very hesitant to go there.
That makes sense. It seems like a very different situation from, say, deliberately damaging the walls.
Totally different.
Yeah.
And that difficulty in proving intent or negligence regarding market value is a major reason why landlords try to use these contract clauses in the first place to avoid having to prove it in court. They want the contract to do the work for them.
Got it. So, to recap the legal attack points for you as a tenant, challenge the clause directly using the Consumer Protection Act. It's likely unfair. Challenge it under the Civil Code, unfair standard terms, maybe get the penalty reduced. And if they sue under tort law, the defense is often.
Yeah.
This is pure economic loss, and you can't prove intent or negligence related to market value.
That's a pretty good summary of the main lines of defense and attack for the tenant. Okay, we've got the legal arguments, but how does this actually play out in court? You hear about these cases. Are landlords winning, or are tenants successfully defending against these claims?
Well, the source material suggests it's pretty mixed. Judicial decisions have gone both ways. There isn't a single clear-cut answer yet from the courts on how to consistently handle this.
So it's not a slam dunk for either side. Landlords sometimes lose.
Oh, definitely. There are cases cited where landlords lost badly. One high court case is mentioned where the landlord sued for millions in lost value after selling the stigmatized property for less. The court said, no, the loss was psychological, not physical damage, basically pure economic loss. So no compensation was due from the deceased's family.
That reinforces the pure economic loss argument we just talked about.
It does, and there's another Supreme Court ruling mentioned where a tenant wasn't liable when someone else living with them caused the property to become stigmatized. Again, showing the court's reluctance to award damages for this kind of value loss against the tenant or their estate in many situations. But you said it's mixed, so sometimes the landlords do win or get something.
Yes, the source mentions cases where landlords were awarded damages figures like over 730,000 NTD, even up to 3.72 million NTD in one instance. The exact reasoning isn't fully detailed in what we have, but it shows courts can find ways to award compensation under certain circumstances.
Any idea what might make the difference?
It's not entirely clear from the summary, but it highlights the complexity. There's also a case mentioned where a buyer sued a seller because a tenant died before the sale closed and the buyer got a price reduction. That's not tenant versus landlord, but it shows courts do acknowledge the financial impact of the stigma in some contexts.
So the legal system is kind of wrestling with how to fit this market reality value loss due to stigma into the existing legal boxes.
That seems like a fair way to put it, especially within the traditional tort law framework that's more geared towards physical harm.
What factors seem to sway the courts one way or the other in these cases?
Based on the source, several things seem relevant. How the court frames the loss. Is it pure economic loss or somehow tied to a right? How strong is any evidence about the tenant's state of mind, their intent or negligence, again, usually very hard for the landlord to prove? The specific wording and fairness of the life-cherishing clause itself, is it clearly excessive?
And the Consumer Protection Act angle is more relevant now, too.
Definitely. Whether that act applies makes a big difference now. Also, can the landlord show concrete proof of actual financial loss, like appraisals or sale comparisons? Even then, the pure economic loss argument might still block the claim.
Any other factors?
One viewpoint mentioned is whether the landlord already had a deal to sell the place before the incident happened, and then the buyer demanded a lower price. That might make the loss seem more concrete, less speculative to a judge.
So it really depends on the specifics. Landlords have a tough case, but it's not impossible for them depending on the judge and the details.
That seems to be the situation, yes. The burden is high for the landlord, but outcomes vary.
Let's shift focus back to the human side. For a tenant or their family, just seeing that clause in the lease, even if it might not hold up in court, the stress must be immense.
Absolutely. It creates huge anxiety. You're potentially facing a massive financial claim, maybe even being told your family has to buy the property where a tragedy occurred. It's the threat of a long, expensive, emotionally draining legal fight.
And the psychological weight of it, especially if someone is already struggling.
It's deeply concerning. And those daredevil lease examples, while extreme, show how these clauses can feel intimidating, almost threatening.
Just awful. But amidst all this potential stress, there's a really crucial piece of legal protection in Taiwan for the family, for the heirs, right?
Yeah.
Something they absolutely need to know.
Yes, this is vital. It's the system of limited inheritance. In Mandarin, that's the Gaiko Jisheng Yoxianzeren.
Limited inheritance. What does that mean practically if a landlord tries to claim millions from the deceased tenant's family using one of these clauses?
It means the heirs, the family members who inherit, are only responsible for the deceased person's debts up to the value of the assets they actually inherit. Their liability is capped.
Okay, break that down. If the tenant didn't have many assets, say just a small bank account.
Then the landlord can only claim against that small bank account. The heirs do not have to pay the rest of the debt out of their own pockets, sell their own homes, or use their personal savings. Their personal wealth is protected.
That's a massive safety net. So even if a clause demands 75% of a multi-million-dollar property value, if the tenant only left behind, say, 50,000 NTD, the heirs only risk losing that 50,000.
Correct. The limited inheritance system is a fundamental protection against being bankrupted by inherited debt. The landlord's claim is limited to the value of the estate itself.
And that explains why landlords often push for guarantors, right?
Precisely. Guarantors, especially if they sign as joint and several guarantors, liable, are a way for the landlord to try and get around the limited inheritance protection. The guarantor agrees to be personally liable for the debt, regardless of what the tenant's estate is worth.
So the guarantor doesn't have that limited liability shield.
Correct. They are potentially on the hook with their own assets.
Okay, so the clause is scary, maybe legally weak, but limited inheritance is a key protection for heirs, while guarantors need to be extremely careful. What do tenant advocacy groups think about all this, like the Mama Foundation?
Groups like Mama, who are well respected for their work on tenant rights in Taiwan, are generally very skeptical about these life-cherishing clauses. They focus heavily on fairness and legal validity.
What's their main stance?
They argue pretty strongly that clauses forcing heirs to buy the property or demanding really excessive compensation are likely clearly unfair, and therefore they should be invalid under both the civil code principles we talked about and especially now under the Consumer Protection Act, thanks to that 2023 change.
So they echo the legal arguments we've been discussing.
Yes, very much so. They also highlight the point that excessive compensation demands can be viewed as penalty clauses, which courts have the power to reduce significantly.
Do they have advice for landlords too?
They do. They basically caution landlords that putting overly harsh or unfair clauses in contracts is risky because they might just get thrown out or reduced by a court anyway. It might not provide the solid protection the landlord thinks it does.
Why is it helpful for tenants listening to know what groups like Mama think?
Because their public stance and resources, like talks or information materials, help level the playing field. They make it clear that these clauses aren't set in stone. They can be challenged. It empowers tenants to know their rights and gives them avenues to seek help and information, countering that feeling of helplessness you might get when facing a landlord over a complex issue.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. What the clauses are, why landlords use them, the strong legal challenges under consumer law and civil code, the landlord's difficulties with tort law, the mixed court results, the crucial shield of limited inheritance, and the expert view. Let's try to boil this down. What are the key takeaways? The practical steps for a tenant who sees one of these clauses.
Right. Let's summarize the reality. First, these life-cherishing clauses are not automatically valid. Don't assume they are. They face serious legal hurdles, especially now with the Consumer Protection Act applying to most residential leases. Arguments about unfairness and excessive penalties are strong.
And landlords have trouble suing under general tort law, too.
Correct. The pure economic loss argument and the difficulty proving intent make tort claims very challenging for them. Plus, the limited inheritance system is a fundamental backstop protecting the personal assets of heirs.
So knowing all that, what should you, the tenant, actually do? Let's get practical.
Okay, most importantly, what to do before you sign anything.
Step 1.
Read every word, seriously. Take your time. Look specifically for any mention of unnatural death, suicide, stigmatized property, compensation related to these events, or any obligation for your family to buy the property.
Be aware of your rights under the Consumer Protection Act.
Yes. Remember, your lease is likely a consumer contract now. You have rights against unfair terms. If you find a clause like this and it feels wrong or excessive, try to negotiate. Ask the landlord to remove it or change it. Maybe they won't, but you have to ask.
Ask for explanations, too.
Definitely. Ask them to explain exactly what it means and what happens. If you're still unsure or the clause seems really bad, get advice before signing. Talk to a lawyer or a group like Mama. And honestly, if a contract feels predatory or just makes you deeply uncomfortable, your best move might be to walk away and find another place. Don't sign under pressure.
Okay, what about during the signing?
If you did manage to negotiate changes, make absolutely sure those changes are written into the final contract document. Don't rely on verbal promises. Both you and the landlord should initial or sign next to the changes. And always, always keep a full, signed copy of the lease for yourself.
And finally, what if you've already signed and an issue comes up? or if you're an heir facing a claim.
First, remember the legal challenges we discussed. Know that the clause isn't automatically enforceable. If you're an heir, the first thing to remember is limited inheritance. State clearly that your liability is capped by the value of the estate. Don't let anyone pressure you into thinking you owe money from your own pocket.
And seek help.
Immediately. If a landlord makes a claim based on one of these clauses, get professional legal advice right away. A lawyer can assess your specific contract and situation and tell you the best way forward. And keep records of everything, all letters, emails, communication with the landlord.
That's really clear, practical advice. It emphasizes that tenants aren't powerless here.
Knowledge and knowing where to get help are your best defenses.
These clauses, they really sit at a difficult crossroads, don't they? Property rights, market anxieties, but also profound personal tragedy and grief. It forces a tough question. Is it fair for the financial consequences of market psychology around death to fall so heavily on tenants or their families?
It really does. It pushes us to think about what fairness and humanity should look like in a housing contract, especially when life takes unexpected, tragic turns.
Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's complicated, a big rim, but so important for tenants to understand. I feel much clearer on it now.
Glad we could shed some light on it. Being informed is definitely key in the rental market.
And for everyone listening, if this deep dive helped you understand these life-cherishing clauses and your rights better, we'd love it if you'd let us know, maybe leave a comment. And definitely subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration into these kinds of complex issues.